Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's Inspiring Leadership podcast. I'm delighted to have Brigadier James Stevenson. He and I were at Staff College together many years ago, and I'm really sad that I didn't get to know him as well as I'm starting to get to know him now, because what a fascinating man he is. We together have described this session as leadership through war, law, and technology. He had a very successful career in the army for, I think, some 38 years, rising to brigadier. With some fascinating roles. He commanded the Royal Scots, the Royal Regiment, or the Royal Regiment of Scotland, the Royal Regiment, I think. Is that right? Is that, James? Can you help me?
Well, in those days, when it existed, the Royal Scots, the Royal Regiment, and then, of course, now all of those Scottish infantry battalions merged and amalgamated and formed the present-day Royal Regiment of Scotland, or Scots.
Yeah, there's a lot of royal in there. Anyway, as well as that, James has had a variety of fascinating roles, including a deputy at NATO Special Ops Headquarters. He's served in all the major wars that you know about, a lot of time in Northern Ireland and Afghanistan and Bosnia and places like that. So without further ado, and the other thing to add to that, I would say, is that he then spent about 8 years at Deloitte before he's now the managing director for Europe for a AI tech startup. You don't get many army officers doing that, called DscvryAI. James, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Jonathan.
Yeah.
A pleasure to have been invited.
Thank you. Well, no, and we've been talking about it, you and I, for some years. And I think now that you've done this AI startup, I think it's really good. And with some colleagues from your days, Sharad, one of your colleagues from your days at Deloitte. But I think it's really interesting that while you're at Deloitte, you spent quite a lot of time at the university in France, the Deloitte University, and you've written this fascinating paper, which you've very kindly shared with me, which I really liked. And the paper that you wrote was called Leadership Going from Good to Great, What the Specialist Military Philosophy Can Offer to Business. So tell us about that. Why did you decide you were going to write something like that?
Well, I think that all of us who've been through a military career, you'll appreciate this, Jonathan, have had the privilege, and I put it that way because it is unusual for professionals to be schooled in leadership and have the opportunity to practice leadership in quite the way that the military are and do. And it's something that I have noticed a paucity of in the commercial world, and we can perhaps come back to that a little bit later on, by which I mean not leadership per se, but a sort of a formal way of helping people to develop as leaders. And so I think when people say, oh, everyone's got a book in them, I felt that I'd built up this well of opinion, but I hope as well experience, not just mine, but others, on the subject of leadership, which is something that fascinates me, I think fascinates a lot of people, because it's such a kind of hard to define, almost ethereal quality that is also hugely misunderstood. And I'll say right up front that I would not presume in any way to be an expert. And one of the things that I put in my paper is I believe fundamentally that you should not, by which I mean I included, should not assume to teach leadership, but it most certainly can be learned. So I think that my wish was to gather all my thoughts in one place and put it, in a sense, keep it. I haven't published it really widely. I'm not sure if I will. I've shared it with friends, but it's an opportunity for me just to gather my thoughts and say, right, in one place, here is everything that I personally think about and have experienced about leadership, perhaps good and bad.
Yeah, and this podcast is going to come out just a few days before my third book launch. And this is The CEO's Compass, How to Navigate Your Team Through Turbulent Times. And you, more than anybody, have been a commanding officer, been a CEO. You've had to lead teams through very turbulent times. And you are mentioned in the book in chapter 10 and the current role that you've got. And I think it's very timely because I've worked until late last night to get the manuscript out of the door to the typesetter. and it was an 8-hour stint. I just had to get it done and get it across to him. I do think you should publish what you've written, and I think there's more in you than just the paper that you've written. I think there's a whole life story. I mean, including you climbing the Eiger and the Matterhorn. I know not the North Face, but those are stories in itself. So you've had a wealth of experience, and I think it's this. I do like your leadership is learned. It's not taught. It should not be taught. That time and again with, you're one of about 400 guests that I've had on this episode. There isn't a silver bullet. There isn't like, do this in all circumstances and you can do no wrong. It depends on the circumstance. It depends who you're with. Good fortune, good luck, bad luck, bad fortune, the market's going against you, life going against you, a divorce, whatever it might be. But there are some sort of basic fundamentals that people can learn, principles and ways of being with the people they lead, which will get better results. And there are things you can definitely do, which will really screw things up. I mean, I'd love to begin with how to really screw things up. James, you've seen people really get it badly wrong, whether it be in Deloitte, in the tax side there, or startups like your own. And particularly, you must have had, among the very good leaders that you've had, some real horror stories. So without naming anybody, what have you seen, and perhaps even little anecdotes or stories, where it's been really bad leadership and you go, if you want to do anything, don't do this? How about just give us a couple of examples? There must be something that comes to the front of your mind.
Well, there are, of course. I think, though, that I wouldn't judge good and bad leadership necessarily by outcomes, because I think, as you've pointed out, Jonathan, a lot of those are down to chance, no matter how well you've prepared, no matter how good or bad a leader you are. So I think the way I would define poor leaders and poor leadership is down to sort of character. And as you know, I feel pretty strongly about the various natural characteristics that make up a person and thereby, by extension, make up a leader. And I guess the way I would describe some of the leaders I've come across in a certain nation, which you might be able to guess, most of them are brilliant, and that's all great. But I did notice a distinction between what I would call, and I'm not especially sort of religious, but I use this sort of biblical example. I think it works quite well. I use a distinction between Old Testament and New Testament leadership.
Okay.
So, and you can probably imagine what's coming. I mean, the Old Testament leader was very fire and brimstone, and actually quite sort of religious to an extent that might make one feel slightly uncomfortable. But an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and quite aggressive. Whereas, New Testament leadership is more forgiving, more sort of open, less command orientated, more authenticity based, more credibility based. Very simplistic.
I haven't seen that one. I like that. I like that analogy.
I and there's not been many. I mean, there's been a couple that I've come across, and I was like, God, Old Testament, Old Testament, and that, and they're quite that they definitely err, if not sit comfortably within the toxic leadership category. And I think if I were to define a type of leadership which I think we should all fear most, it is the toxic leader, because they are they think they're effective, and they may well be effective in terms of outcomes, back to the outcome point, but on the way they leave a trail of mainly psychological destruction, and they form teams, if that's indeed possible in those circumstances, which are ostensibly frightened. And one of the themes I discuss is what a leader owes their followers, what their followers might expect from their leader. And I use a simple construct, C3S, so 3 C's and an S. So confidence being the most important one in a sense as a basis that needs to be instilled in team members. Competence, obviously the follower expects a degree of competence from their leader, which extends to a leader's ability to develop those followers as well, of course. Contentment, and I've used that rather than happiness, which I'm not afraid of, but it begins with C, so contentment was fitted better. In other words, you need to have a happy team within reason. And then finally, security. And of course, security is more psychological than physical. And I think if you cannot generate security in a team, then you're not going to have a willing leadership, a willing team with a good philosophy.
Yeah, I like the C3S: confidence, competence, contentment, and security. And when I think of the Old Testament toxic leaders, I've been listening again to Dr. Carol Dweck, Mindset, her latest iteration of it. Interesting enough, she brought out the good examples, and out came Jack Welch. But of course, this was written before he had his phenomenal crash, where people realized that he'd been shifting numbers between years to make it look good. And he was actually, it was Neutron Jack. And so he isn't anymore spoken about, and the boy wonder and be like Jack. And Yank, was it Rank and Yank, where if you were in the top 10%, you got pulled out, whereas the others got yanked up. But in her book, this idea of fixed and growth mindset, I think you can add that to the Old Testament toxic fixed mindset, that they think that leadership is a talent that you are born with, you're given. I am right, and actually showing any vulnerability is a mistake. I remember one of my leaders, she was in Microsoft. She was a very senior person in the marketing, almost a CMO kind of. And she said to her team, after she'd been grumpy in one of the meetings I was facilitating, she came back after and said, guys, Richard and James, I just want to say sorry. I was very short with you. It was unacceptable. That was poor behavior on my part. I apologize. And they looked relieved and grateful, and they carried on. It was really good. It really changed the atmosphere of the room, because it had got really quite difficult. And her boss, who was over from America, the super boss, was in on the meeting, and afterwards took her to one side while I was there and said, you should never do that. Don't ever do that. Don't show your weakness to people. Don't apologize. I'm so against that. My friend, Jeff Nischwitz from Florida, Jeff said to me, there's 10 words, 3 phrases, which mark out the New Testament inspiring leaders that I write about in the CEO's Compass, which is they can say these 10 words, 3 phrases. I was wrong. I don't know. And I need some help. And I think of General Rupert Smith, who you knew, one of the great gurus of our days in the army, of the Ginger Group, this group of free thinking New Testament kind of people like Richard Dannett. And he said to me, yeah, I was wrong. He said, I walked into one meeting when I was Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe, and they were all waiting on a presentation which I was to give. And they went, General, what do you think about this problem? And he sat at the back and put his feet up on the chairs in front in a very relaxed style. They went, guys, I haven't got a clue. I mean, that's why I asked you. I don't know. What do you think? And to be comfortable with not having to be right, not having to have the answer, to show your vulnerability and make it safe where people can admit. Because you've seen it all too well. When people feel it isn't safe, they cover up, they obfuscate. Look at Lehman Brothers. They started to lie. If it wasn't going up, when it started to go down, they changed their graphs. What's your experience, both in Deloitte and elsewhere?
All of that resonates very, very sort of strongly with me. I think that I couldn't agree more. I think you have to show humility. That's traditionally understood. I mean, that's nothing new, albeit not every leader does show that humility, which is a mistake. But on the other hand, you cannot be, a soft touch. You can't be forever just sort of saying, sorry, I don't know, I don't understand. So, great leadership, and this is nothing new, it is a combination, isn't it, of things. And again, in my musings, I sort of thought about things initially, obviously from the leader's perspective, and I quite like sort of little acronyms, and came up with DICE, as you know. So, what are the sort of the principal qualities of a leader, and how does that work? And I'll come on to the point in a minute about this balance, but I'll use this to illustrate it. So DICE stands for decency, integrity, competence, and effect. And rather like C3S, you form a Venn diagram, and naturally enough, the overlapping bit of the Venn diagram in the middle is necessarily very small, because getting leadership right in both perspectives is pretty hard. It's a small target to hit. But the point about DICE is, if you look at decency and integrity at the top, that sort of forms, in a sense, a foundation of leadership. But in itself, it may not actually get the job done. You may just be a decent person. And rightly or wrongly, you pick an example of a world leader who had decency and integrity in someone like Barack Obama. And interestingly, the legacy associated most with him was his indecisiveness around the red lines in Syria, for example, where he didn't perhaps demonstrate sufficient of the C and the E, the competence and the effect. Now, conversely, if you're too much orientated towards competence and effect, then you could err towards toxicity, which we've talked about. So, but you still got to have it. And by the way, you have to reserve the right, don't you, as a leader, to get a bit stroppy from time to time. I mean, you can't always be the nice person. But I think the point is that stroppiness and irritation and occasionally making your presence felt is necessary in terms of motivation and corrective leadership behavior. But you've got to balance it out at the end. You've got to equalize, haven't you, with a sort of explanation after. It's a bit like disciplining a child. I used to I realized pretty quickly with my boys that if I gave them a good bollocking, I would want to just pause for a bit and go upstairs, see them and say, look, do you understand why I was cross? I think that's important. So there are lots of parallels with parenthood and everything else. But I think the DICE construct's quite interesting. And again, I was very proud of myself for coming up with it. And I thought, oh, well, let's just Google it and just make sure that it's original thinking. And of course, it's not. There's loads of ways of putting it. So it's not original thinking, but it just happens to be the way I think about it. And so you have this foundation of decency and integrity, and something that I initially called manifestation was a bit of a mouthful. So maybe operation is competence and effect. And you can't have one without the other, is the point.
Yeah. And I think this is brought out very clearly when people hire for KSA, knowledge, skills, and attitude, that knowledge and skills can be developed. But attitude, you've got to hire for attitude and fire for attitude. If they've not got the character, the attitude, you're never going to make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. And however, I don't want to be fixed mindset about this is right, that is wrong. It's just that a bit like how many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is as many as it needs, and it depends if the light bulb wants to change. But I don't want to get too woke about this. All I'm saying is, if somebody, I don't know, a young officer is very ambitious to get on and they're quite competent, but competition is very intense, they might do something where they're lacking in integrity. They might borrow some friends' report, copy their essay or something. Now, are they fundamentally broken and evil? No, actually, but when writing an essay on integrity and character and doing the right things as an officer, they might be so ashamed of that, they'll never, ever do it again. I remember, Admiral Bill McRaven, who we had on this podcast, and he is one of my great heroes, and I think you respect him too. Talk about you can't search trust was a comment you and I talked about. When he talked about as a young lad, he broke into the ammunition compound and left his pearl-handled pistol it fell out of his pocket, and they escaped away from the guards, and the sirens went off and all sorts. He came back with his friends, and they all hid, and they thought they got away with it. And his father came in and interrogated him about, were you out there? He went, no, sir. And he said, that was the last time I ever lied. Because when he got up to bed, and you probably read the book, but he climbs into bed, and beside the bed is his pearl-handled pistol. Like, his dad knew that he was in the compound, and he had lied to his father. And from that moment onwards, he decided that wasn't going to be the way he was going to do it. And I think back to my own life, and even my career. In the drive to get on in my career, I sometimes cut corners. And looking back now, I'm ashamed of that. And I'm now in a place where I'm very comfortable that I don't choose to do that ever again. So I think there's something about attitude and character, integrity, I think, as you say, decency as well. But it's got to be mixed with people have got to know. I talked about the 10 words, 3 phrases. As you say, they can't keep saying, I don't know, I was wrong, I don't know, I was wrong. A couple of times, that's okay. But the third time, fool on you, because you've actually hired someone who is an absolute idiot. What's your thoughts, James?
Yeah, no, I mean, it is about balance, isn't it? And I think, by the way, Bill McRaven, a great hero of mine, and I was lucky enough to meet him a few times, and a tremendous example to everyone. And if people haven't read what he's written, they really ought to. And I think, as you pointed out, you can't surge trust. The point there being that it was actually in the context of, wasn't it, of when David Petraeus, another great man, was surging troops into Iraq, I think, at the time, and so McRaven picked up on that word and said, well, it's all very well you can surge capability, but you cannot surge trust, and you've got to build it, nurture it, protect it, because you can break it just like that. And I thought it was really important, and it underpins everything, underpins leadership completely. Most important thing of all. So yes, I think that we all err, we all stray, we all make mistakes, we're all tempted, and I think actually maturity and time spent on this planet allows you the confidence to think twice, about something. Everyone's given a shortcut to take if you want it, and I think it's worth dwelling on it for a bit and saying, how would I feel in the morning? Is it right? And I think the great phrase, if it or a play on the great phrase, if it doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. And I think you have to be able to, without wanting to sound too sort of puritanical about it, you do have to be able to live with yourself for decisions you've made. And we've all got, memories of decisions and actions that we took over our lives that we would rather not have taken. But that's by the by, and you just have to learn from that and hope not to repeat it.
Yeah. No, I think that's really good. And that's really, in my compass, that's the very first point is moral integrity, your values, your beliefs, what you will. A gentleman knows what he will do and what he won't do. Ladies does too. And I'm very interested by your paper, which I think it's got some really great lessons in there. But this idea of specialist military philosophy, you working in the Deputy NATO Specialist Operations Headquarters, you've met a lot of special operators. Now, what is it, in your view, that makes them special? What are the qualities that they have that we can learn from, and the business leaders listening in 126 countries around the world to this conversation, James? While I like learning lessons from the military and taking them into business, what is it that business can learn from specialist military leadership?
Well, I think it's probably a two-way thing. I'm not suggesting that business, it's a one-way street at all.
No,
actually,
no.
The thing that appealed to me about looking into this was just how applicable I felt specialist military leadership styles were to the commercial world. And the reason is obvious. A lot of people who talk about military leadership, and indeed military people, and you experienced that. I mean, I spoke to 250 odd people in Deloitte who were leaving or had left the military and were thinking of transitioning into the commercial world, And one of the things I said to them is that you will be typecast straight away before you walk through that door. There will be a preconceived idea of what you are and who you are. So, for example, be careful what you wear, be careful what you say, etc., etc. But the perception in the majority of the civilian, world is that the military form of leadership is much more command-based than otherwise. In other words, shouty and stampy. And I used to say at Deloitte University when I tried to explain the difference, I said, look, there is a place for command. If heaven forbid this room were to burst into flames, and I happen to know that, if you jumped out of this first floor window, there'd be a nice soft landing and you wouldn't get burnt, I would probably just use a few expletives and tell you to get the bleep out of there. I don't suppose you'd line up and say, James, excuse me, we don't talk to each other like that in Deloitte. You'd probably do as you were told, and you'd realise why. So there is a place for it. But there clearly isn't a place for shouting and stamping to get normal business done. And I think in the specialist military world, if you do that, it doesn't work. You tend to get told to poke off, and quite rightly so, because you're not by any means the most competent. But crucially, you are the person who holds the responsibility. And I think that it took me a little while to work this out when studying this. And to a certain extent, experiencing it. When it comes down to what your followers in that environment really, really need, it's sort of immutable, irreducible minimum requirement that they need, it's back to this sense of security. They want to know that you have their back. And it is the only definite gift that you can bestow if you're a young person surrounded by people better than you. No matter what you have done to get to where you've got to, sometimes you have nothing to offer in terms of competence and ability that is better than them. But what you can as the leader do is say, if everything goes wrong, then the buck will stop with me. And I realized pretty quickly that actually in that community, that is like gold dust to them, because it allows them the freedom to get on with their job. Now, interestingly and sadly, at the moment, it doesn't need me to tell you that there is this debate raging at the moment around certain parts of the veteran community and the fact that they were led to believe that by their leaders, not just military, but civilian as well. And now there is a danger that is going to come back to bite them. And that is why this is so dangerous for them and so unsettling for them.
What is your view on that, James? It's a debate going on, as far as I can pick it up, and it's interesting. We obviously had.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I have a view. The danger with someone like me having a view is you don't have the full picture. But I do think that clearly it's a very complex area. Fundamentally, though,
just explain, by the way, James, before you go further into it, for those listening around the world, they may not have a clue what we're talking about. So just give them the synopsis of what has happened in the sort of political and military circles, which has caused such an upset.
So as many people know, that this particular debate revolves around Northern Ireland and veterans who served in Northern Ireland, and especially those from the specialist military community. That conflict, the Troubles, went on for 30-odd years, and actually much longer if you're a historian, but in our lifetime, viscerally 30-odd years. Many of us had experience of it. The previous government imposed an act which effectively drew a line under not just terrorist offences, but alleged British security force offences. This current government has decided to repeal that act, which potentially exposes, and already is exposing, individuals to have their past raked over and being brought back. And that is extremely unsettling, particularly when the other side, if I could put it that way, are essentially absolved from that. So there's a real sense of imbalance and unfairness. But that said, nothing is ever simple. and a lot of people are thinking hard about how to resolve this. But fundamentally, what I think is deeply unfair is that individuals who acted in good faith, who did their duty, and I can say, as far as anyone can say, that the due diligence was extreme. It was highly impressive, and the clearance of operations was done at the highest level, such that individuals who had to act on the ground were and should have been confident that, provided they acted within the law, then they would be, in a sense, respected and protected for the actions that they carried out. Now, with the benefit of hindsight and 30, 40 years on, a new perspective is being applied to those historic actions, which again doesn't make sense. Laws have changed which suddenly make actions different. Well, that doesn't make sense. So that is the issue here, and it needs to be resolved.
Yeah, and it's a
petition that can be signed, that many people have signed. About 194,000 people have signed it, and we need to sign it. We get more people signing it effectively.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's hope it does get resolved, because I think it's from many I know who have served loyally, they now find that their lives under threat. And I've even got a friend who's had a trigger of PTSD from it all, because he just doesn't know what the future holds, and it's so uncertain, and his life is in the balance years later. Okay. I don't want to belittle that, but I just want to park that because it's such a complex area. Let's talk about, in your experience, the inspiring leaders that you've met, both in the military, Deloitte, in business. I think you mentioned Phil Mills, Bob Bruce, and your brother, Shannon, as people that you just want to give a call out for, and potentially as future guests on this Inspiring Leadership podcast, because you find them inspiring. And if I find you an inspiring leader and then you find them inspiring leaders, that's the kind of people I want on. I don't want agencies approaching me. If you're listening to this, I'm not interested in who you're trying to sell, so you get paid for it. I actually want those that have earned it because others find them inspiring. So tell me about those three people.
Well, I'll caveat it by saying I haven't mentioned it to any of the three of them. So if they happen to listen to this, they might be surprised. But
you've got time.
That's different, and of course they are three out of a number that I could name. But and they all come from different environments. So Phil Mills was my boss for a while at Deloitte, and displays, I think, all the right characteristics of a great leader in terms of his sort of personal qualities and his consideration of others. And he looked after me extremely well. I'm hugely sort of indebted to him, and he is now running Deloitte UK, which made him a useful friend to have, of course. Bob, good friend of both yours and mine, and I could name a number of other military leaders as well.
Tell us what Bob is doing now.
Bob is working for RBS, having left as a 2-star, left the military as a 2-star, and he's also the governor of Edinburgh Castle, and involved in various Royal Scots trustee issues as well. So he's got a very broad perspective and portfolio of responsibilities now, and brings to those a combination of sort of charm and amusement and respect and decency and all the things that one might hope and expect from someone at that level. And as a result, is I believe very successful, and rightly so. So he's going strong, and then my brother, of course, 2 years younger than me, 2.5 years younger than me, very successful in Procter and Gamble, which he joined directly from university, and ended up basically running the operation in China, and has some fascinating stories to tell about that. Well, whether he chooses to tell them or not is going to be up to him. I don't want to commit him to anything, but he'd be an interesting person to talk to. And spent pretty much all of his adult working life abroad with the firm.
Well,
and now gets involved in a lot of sort of charitable stuff, and that's all good. He's
Well, I think that's really nice, because those who are listening won't be able to see James's room, but he took me through some pictures that were behind there, which are really all around family history of the Stevensons, where it's all around sort of the Northeast, and, the 3rd Volunteers in artillery, and then a naval officer as grandfather, and fascinating history there. And I'm interested, James, with that legacy, what's your sort of life story that shaped you into the leader you are today, but you were when you were in the army for your 38 years? What were the early days that led you to do the impressive things that you've done? Because I have the deepest of respect of what you've achieved, some of which we've talked about, some of which we can't talk about, but you've done an awful lot. What shaped you? Who shaped you?
Well, I think let me say, first of all, you're very kind. One of the reasons I took a while to say yes to coming onto this over the years was because whenever I thought about what I had to say, I could think of a number of other people who had a lot more to say than me, and that still applies. But I say that because I suspect we're all in a similar situation in terms of what motivated us to try and be who we are today. And I think I would point to 2 influences. One, my parents and my family, and 2, the education that I had, the schooling that I had, and of course, and to a certain extent, that included Sandhurst. Anyone in 1981 who said they enjoyed the first 5 weeks of Sandhurst is lying. But goodness me, did it do me good? I mean, it really sorted me out. But without the grounding I'd had before that, I probably wouldn't have got through those 5 weeks, or indeed any subsequent tests in the military thereafter, to be perfectly honest. So what made that initial grounding so important, I think, was ultimately a sort of laser focus on doing the right thing, which on very many occasions, to the despair, I'm sure, of my parents, I failed to do, but eventually at least worked out that was important. In fact, it was more than important. It had to be the foundation of who you were as you went on with your life. And without getting into the sort of controversies as viewed today around how one was punished for misdemeanors at school.
Where were you at school? I'm sure that's what some people are asking.
I was at a prep school in Oxford, called the Dragon School, which is
a big
school.
Yeah.
600 odd children, and I think first set up for the children of Oxford Dons, actually, but by the time I got there it was open to all sorts, and it was an amazing school. It still is. My father's family basically sort of went there, so over the generations, and it just somehow, even at the tender age of 8 to 13, taught you, or at least instilled in you, the difference between right and wrong. It also, importantly, and this I think is, again, maybe slightly controversial, but it matters to me, it taught you how to take a punishment. And that was not in an abusive way. Certainly I never felt abused or any of that sort of thing, thankfully. But it made me braver. It made me more courageous, as far as I can say I am. And I wasn't always like that, I can tell you. Initially, I'd be scared stiff of, a punishment. But eventually one was sort of conditioned, if that's the right word, to understand that, if you did something wrong, you had to face the consequences. And when you face the consequences, you had to do that, in the right way. And that was a very strengthening experience, which, I took into the rest of my life, and I think made me a better person. It certainly made me more resilient, and it instilled in me something that I'd like to think. I mean, goodness, who can say this with any degree of confidence? But I really, really, really tried to abide by a philosophy of never give up. And it was interesting. Sam Warburton, the great Welsh and British Lions rugby player and captain, basically the term, the quote I remember from him was "never, never, never give up." Just simple, and actually at some point, you probably do need to give up if you're heading for utter disaster. But the point being is, you really do need to develop that ability just to keep going. And I think that, my parents helped me with that. My schooling helped me with that, and thereafter, my experiences in the army helped me with that.
That's a really great story, and I do think that even in my own one, as I was writing the book and thinking back to my doing airborne selection, and it was about these little chunks. I think someone explained to me more recently, who'd done special forces SAS selection, that they looked upon it in 10-minute chunks. I'm just going to do the next 10 minutes, and then the next 10 minutes, and the next 10 minutes. And I remember when the instructor, let's call him Corporal Snatch to save his embarrassment, but he was horrible, abusive, and hated officers. And so, the form, you keep going back to get the soldiers who are straggling, and you bring them up to the front. And so the officers do much more. And then you have a rest at the bottom of the hill of Heartbreak Hill, and they go, everybody can have a rest, but the officers, you guys run up and down the hill while the soldiers watch you, because you have to show and lead by example. And if you're going to have the privilege of leading these people, you got to be even fitter and stronger than them. So I was sent back to get Jenkins, let's call him. And I was encouraging him along, and Snatch goes, carry his pack. And I go, but Corporal, but staff, I think you have to call them staff, didn't you? I've already got my own pack. He goes, don't argue with me, give me 20 press-ups. So I was doing 20 press-ups. And he goes, carry his pack. So I then put his pack at my front, my arms through it, and off he goes like a rabbit to join the group. And I'm struggling. I can't run. I'm just walking as fast as I can. And he's going, give up. You're an absolute loser. There's a Land Rover back there. Just ring the bell, give up, get on it, and F off. Go back to unit. You're not good enough to be airborne. Thank you, Corporal. I'll keep going. And he goes, sir's got a zit on his face. I said, yes, staff, I'm giving birth. Oh, yeah, what to? To an NCO. Get down, give me 20 press-ups. and I could jest, but of course, when he got Jenkins back to take his pack back, and it was only 5 minutes, I was wrecked, absolutely wrecked. And I managed to get up with the group, but I just was silent after that. I was mute. I could hardly breathe. But I still think back to that never give up. And I don't know where it came from me, but it was the thing, seeing it in small chunks. Even in writing this book, the next one, The Seer's Compass, I was supposed to have 2 weeks holiday, and my wife and I agreed that there was just so much to be done with the book before I get to the printer that I would work through the 2 weeks. And I worked every day, 8-9 hours a day. I worked last night until 9 o'clock, and then finally got off with the help of my daughter Harriet, who acted as another editor, bless her. She was very impressive, even though she's got a 5-month-old baby. But this idea of determination has really inspired me from what you've said. Let's go on to think about, I talked about some tough times there, but what about darkest moments in your life and what it taught you, James? What would you pick up as a story from your many experiences that was dark and difficult, but that you took something from it as a life lesson?
Yes, I think maybe I should start by connecting it back to the previous theme and just quickly say that never give up does not necessarily confine you to a sort of Sisyphean existence for the rest of your life, doing impossible tasks forevermore. In my experience, I think that you'll get to a point where either in your case, and we've all experienced it, you're being deliberately tested. So inevitably there's a finite point, or a finite period during which that will happen until you either do give up or you prove that you're not prepared to give up, or you do give up, but for the right reasons, and that's fine. You've gone as far as you can. Or in reality, you're faced with really complex, difficult, almost impossible, wicked problems and situations, which are more easily resolved if you stick to them, because by sticking to them, you influence behaviors of others involved coming at you as adversaries or from other sides of the argument. And you find that you come to a sort of, there's an opportunity to sort of break out from that challenge a little bit more easily, if you follow me. In terms then of my own sort of darker moments, I think I'll relate it back to working with and dealing with individuals whom I found difficult to deal with, and I don't necessarily mean leaders who I worked for, but actually, they tend to have more leverage over you, and therefore the impact of what you may perceive to be unpleasant behaviour or whatever is greater. But I always used to say to people, actually, because I used to run the Deloitte Military Insight Days, which I love doing. We do them every quarter, and we bring in 40 or 50 people from the military environment, either serving or otherwise, or just left or whatever. And they'd come and dip their toe into Deloitte and connected environments, and I would start by saying to them, how many of you know what you want to do? And interestingly, actually, not that many people with their hands up. But for those who did, I said, how do you know what you want to do? And they said, well, I think I'd like to be a consultant. I said, really? Or I'd like to do this, I'd like to do that. And I say, let's just all be very clear right now. Unless you're doing what you want to do, how can you possibly know you want to do it? And they all look at you slightly sort of curiously and think, well, that's not very helpful, James. And I go, well, I'm not trying to be awkward or difficult. What I'm trying to say is focus on what you know, and what you don't know is what it is you want to do. You may think you know, but what you do know is with whom you want to do it. And again, very simplistic, but I think, coming from the background that we've come from, do have a view on people. I think I'd like to think we're reasonable judges of people. We work with people. In the military, people are central to what we do. Hence why the connection with leadership is so important. You've heard me say how important the people aspect of that is, and I think I'll come on to that later with my top tip. But the people, because one person, whether they're above you, alongside you, or below you, can make you wake up in the morning with that slight sort of feeling in the pit of your stomach saying, I don't really want to go to work today. And I think those are the times when I've had to deal with someone like that's been difficult, because philosophically it's difficult to reconcile with people like that sometimes, because they may be just totally different to you. And I think we all think that everyone's largely the same. And, if I'm a decent person, or I think I'm a reasonable, decent person, then everyone else will be as well. And by the way, they'll sort of think the same way as me. No, and why should they? Some people are just wired differently. And of course, I am wired differently to them, and they probably have exactly the same view of me. And I'm not for a moment suggesting that, one person's right or wrong. It's just you have that irreconcilable difference. And that's really, really hard to deal with. And so people, I think people, great friend of mine, it was Ed Butler actually who said it. You're my friend. I met him early on the trail, and I always attribute this to him because I repeat it many, many times. He said, when you're looking for something to do, the order of priority in terms of your needs are people, and I've covered that, purpose, and we can talk about that in a minute if you want, but we all know what we mean. And then inevitably, when you're looking for a job, pay. But it's in that order. So the 3 Ps of people, purpose, pay. And whenever I've repeated that to groups and audiences, it's one of the few things that they always remember and come back to me on. So very, very wise words. So I think, It's about people. I've never been particularly bothered by events, actually. I've never been particularly fussed about environments and events because, to be honest, there's not much you can do about them. You just got to fight them. You got to deal with them. Yes, you can be scared a little bit by them, but I'm generally much more scared by people than I am by events. To be perfectly honest. Events are just things that happen. They're not sentient. They don't sort of they don't necessarily sort of work out how you're feeling and change. They just carry on blundering on, being difficult and dangerous and frightening. Whereas people can be quite sort of sly and scheming, and that's to me the threat.
Yeah, and it's a lifetime study, I'm finding, to understand people and how they behave. And just when you think you understand what makes people tick, you get surprised by another one. I was, in writing the book, interviewed Sarah Ashman, who's the global CEO of Wolf Olins, which does a lot of the branding, the Olympic branding and things like that. Fabulous company. Really great person to work with. I was lucky enough to be her coach many years ago, introduced by our mutual friend, Johnny Gray. And I think they did a course at Harvard together or something, both equally bright people. And Sarah said these words, which are quite profound, but very simple, but not always easy to execute. She said, we brought up on the Christian principle of treat your neighbor as yourself, as you'd like to be treated. Treat your neighbor like that. She said, it's actually wrong. Treat your neighbor as your neighbor wants to be treated, not as you want to be treated, because they might be different. They might be Muslim when you might be Christian. They might have a different set of ethics and approach to life, but treat them as they want to be treated. And that needs you to really understand them. And I think you're so right to say we just assume people are like us, and they're not. They are so different. And time and again, I've been surprised, whether it be back to school days with an unpleasant guy who was, making my life quite miserable, name calling when I wasn't there, just around the corner. And who was that? And I think it was him. And he said, I just want to make your life miserable. I just don't like you. And I go like, what have I done? I said, you're posh. You got a posh voice. What? I'm like, what can I do about that? And it's just like, so human behavior is a strange one. Hey, look, we're coming towards the end of our time. There's a couple of thoughts I wanted to have. The first one, James, is you've worked with really high caliber teams, and you've worked with specialist people in a whole range of different jobs. On this topic of the toxic turnaround, which so interests me, and my wife's going to write a book on it next year, I think, when I finish mine. We've had enough of book writing. What have you done when you've turned around a toxic team or an individual on the team is toxic? What is your advice to people? They'll be listening out there and they go, I have got, like just James is saying, I just wake up each morning and I dread going to work because I've got to work with this man or this woman and they are just toxic. And it's just like, I almost want to leave and emigrate to avoid this person. What have you done to turn around a toxic team?
Well, I think if you're the leader and the team is toxic, then that's in a way easier. And one would like to think that that's a team you inherit, because if you haven't inherited it, then that's your problem, and you're probably the source of it. So it rather depends whom and what you are dealing with. I think if you're dealing with a toxic boss, it's extremely difficult, if not impossible to deal with until that individual goes or you go. I think the only way you can do it is retain your dignity. You're going to be at cross purposes. It's just the way it is. I think all you can do is try and just to be true to yourself. As a well-known poet said 400 years ago, "To thine own self be true." And I've always believed in that as well. And if it was good enough 400 years ago, it's probably good enough today. That is your compass. That's really all you can do, and just soldier on. I think if you detect, I don't know whether you'd call it toxicity or what. And I took over a role a good while back, and there've been a few incidents to do with bullying and everything else. And in a sense, I was sent. Well, I was told I was sent up there to sort of just sweep clean a little bit and sort of reset the place, which was fine. Having commanded a Scottish infantry battalion, it was had a few methods up my sleeve. And I arrived in a sense with nothing to lose. I was the new guy. I'm a great believer in communication. I think communication is an incredibly important means to a leadership end. Unsurprisingly, I got everyone together, and I basically said, "Look, hello, this is me, and this is how it's going to be." And I'm not in a position to point any fingers at anyone. I wasn't there when it all happened, but be very, very clear that it ain't happening, from now on. And I've got a few basic rules which I think are fair. And I said it's pretty simple. If you want to get on with me, then you stick by those. If you don't, then stand by, because I can actually pull some pretty heavy levers against you, and you're not going to like it. And to an extent, I was threatening, yes, but not in a sort of nasty way. I just wanted to be as fair as possible. I said, look, you're all good people. You're all selected to do this. Just do it properly, and then we're going to be fine. So I think absolute clarity of your own position, your own values and beliefs, and the ability to communicate those succinctly and convincingly, and then you've set out your stall, and then you get on with it, and then in a sense things run. It's the importance of an intent, isn't it? Have an intent, and then just in a sense stand back and tweak the tiller of it, but let everyone else get on with it. That's the thing.
And you make me smile, because I think of General Deloitte, the SAS general, who told a story similar to yours, that he had a sort of slightly toxic situation. I think it was in Korea, where people didn't want to fight. They didn't want to go to the front line and fight. And he had this bugler who didn't want to go to the front. And he said he didn't want to go there. And he said, I have to lay the lesson down. And he said, and if you don't go, I will shoot you for cowardice.
I think he even, I heard him say this, I think he even had his...
I think he took his pistol out and pointed his pistol at him. He said, I will shoot you.
Yeah.
And it's like, wow. And then one officer in the group said, and sir, what would have happened if you didn't go? Deloitte thought for a while, and he said, well, I think I might have shot him. and it's the fact that whether you would or not, and I had a situation in Bosnia with a Serbian general whose soldiers had threatened a couple of my drivers, and we went and we did a deal, and he had them locked up, and I drank Slibovic with this guy. And then afterwards, my sergeant major said to me, and what would you have done if he'd said, I'm not going to lock them up? And I went, yeah, that was a hard one. I don't know. I just because if you have your bluff call, a bit like the red line with Obama, you're lost.
That's why communication and convincing communication, it's almost sort of acting. It's almost sort of thespian. You've got to be able to convince people, whether or not you are going to follow through or not. You've got to be convincing. Interestingly enough, I remember DLB telling that story when I was on the junior division of the Staff College, when he came and gave, I think it was La Vie Militaire, and the senior people come and give the benefit of that ups and downs for us junior folk. And it was obviously an amazing story that he had to tell. And he told that story, but I remember him finishing it with, and thank goodness he decided to go on the patrol, because I clearly could not have followed through on the threat. And the so what from that was, never make a threat you can't follow through on.
Yeah.
And that again is an incredibly important lesson for leaders, because otherwise, you'll lose your credibility immediately as soon as you step back. And we see that in today's world with certain leaders who appear not to follow through on what they say, and it does undermine.
Yeah.
It does undermine credibility. No question.
Good. Well, look, we're at the perfect time for the 2-minute top tip. So would you be kind enough to say who you are, a little bit of a thumbnail of what you've done in the past, what you're doing now, and leave us with your practical top tip, James? Over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Well, I'm James Stevenson. I spent 36 years in the British Army from 1981 to 2017, and as you can imagine, over that time, experienced quite a lot of interesting stuff, quite a lot of multinational experience, and a few other things besides. And left very satisfied. I then went to Deloitte, of all places, and into tax, of all places, but that was Deloitte's idea, not mine, for 8 years. And I have recently drawn the curtain on that about 3 months ago, and I'm working with an old Deloitte friend on a AI startup called DscvryAI, which is fascinating and exciting. So here I am. My top tip for leadership is very, very simple, and Jonathan may want to ask me to expand on it, but it goes like this. Leaders lead people, not things.
That is good. And let's expand, because you've got the P's, haven't you? Tell us about the things.
So, again, nothing is new under the sun. But the number of times that I've asked leaders, okay, what do you lead? What do you do? Oh, well, I lead the following, another three P's actually. Programs, projects, or processes. And I tend to say to them, well, surely you don't actually lead those. You lead people who do those three things. And it's a moot point, because actually a lot of people fundamentally believe that that's not, that they believe that people are managed and things are led. And you could split hairs on this, but the point being is I happen to think that actually leadership is about people. It's about warm-bodied, sentient beings that have needs and feelings, that talk back, that haven't, that can think for themselves. Whereas the three Ps don't. They're just inanimate. They need managing. They need organising. They don't need leading.
That's beautifully put. James, thank you very much. It's been an absolute honour having you on the Inspiring Leadership podcast. You definitely deserve to be here. And I look forward to staying in touch. And thank you once again.
Thank you, Jonathan.